Running Sentences presents Wasteland City, a tale of lost memories. Part 6. Chaos in Second Barrier City. The investigation continues as the search for Corsair Bonaparte, or any clues whatsoever to help them out. The crew also quickly discovers that things in Second Barrier City, however, are not on the happy side. This is a work of fiction. Names, the characters, businesses, places, events, and incidences are products of the author's imagination or in used or silly, fictitiously weird manner. Any resemblance to actual people living dead or actual events is purely of coincidence. Copyright 2021, Michael Honnery. All rights reserved. The train had departed Barrier City quietly as it raced along its set track under the city itself. It emerged over the grassy wastelands below and shot off into the north. In the distance, a small speck of a barrier was just about visible. Mustang sat in the dreary interior of the train car, trying not to fall asleep. The problem was that it was much like the station they had come out of, and which was all gaudy and overdone with style. Things were shining and glittering in such a manner that it looked profane. Plus, they looked like they'd been placed there because someone failed to tell the person putting the place together that less was more. Worse, looking at it all had a weird sleepy effect which had already overtaken Moneypenny and Alex, who were both lightly snoring in their respective seats. The rhythm of the noiseless train and the snoring soon had its toll, and he too slipped off to sleep. The night, while dark, moved over to the early morning sun, then into the regular morning. The train, for its part, had raced along the track and was now approaching the second city of the rich, who had tucked themselves safely away from any harm. The walls looked crystal white, much like the original Barrier City once had, but those walls were now in a state of grayness, and they were just that bit cleaner and nicer to look at, as if they'd had a fresh scrubbing, or at least fresh paint, to it. The train continued on its journey, heading for the only way in to Second Barrier. The three sat restlessly in the train car, having woken up after a few hours of sleep. They couldn't help but feel nervous as it spread about from the uncertainty of what faced them at the station. There had been whispers between Alex and Moneypenny that they should send him out first just in case. Moneypenny had only nodded to that, as Mustang had pretended not to hear them. It wouldn't do any good to hear or think about it. A minute passed before a whistle announced that they were arriving. The smoothness of the ride turned jerky as the train slowed and crawled to a stop. The whistle announced its presence once again and that the ride was now over. The three stood up and headed towards the door. Mustang was taking up the spot in the front so that he wouldn't have to hear them tell him that he needed to be the one first out. That was always the problem with having a rough skin. It set you out to take shots if the enemy was shooting bad ammo. Once people learned that he had rough skin and that skin was a bit bullet resistant, they always tended to send him out first. And also, this happened because he tended to get into gunfights, at least if the enemy was shooting bad ammo. Those chances were slim, though, especially since this place was for the rich. His only hope was that the rich would feel it an expense too far for them to swallow, and that they should go with cheap ammo as well. Out on the train platform stood several guards, all with guns pointed towards anything that could be construed as an exit from the train that had just pulled in. Mustang opened the train car door, poked his head out so that he could look around, and then quietly closed the door. "Hey, come out here!" Inside the train, however, Mustang had turned to his friends and shook his head. "That bad?" Many guards with guns, Alex." "Well, Moneypenny, you got us into this train without getting shot. Can you get us off this train?" I don't think we have much time to risk it. They all seem to have their fingers on the trigger from the couple that I chanced to glance at." Well then, Leader Mustang, why don't you head out there and see that you can take a bullet or two for us? Mustang flinched at being called a leader. He didn't like that sort of pressure being put on him, and of course it meant that he was likely going to be shot first when he came out. He glanced at the nearby window and saw the flash of a gun firing. He could only watch and listen for it as he sighed when the twang of it hitting off the roof greeted them. With no other choice, he hurried back to the door, though crouched a bit lower, just in case. He once again opened the door, and this time came fully out of the train car, hands raised. A few guns pointed at him directly as he came off the train, followed by Alex and then Moneypenny as well. As they came onto the platform itself, the many guards began to step aside, but kept their weapons well trained on them. The trio soon had a clear path to the exit of the station, and with nowhere else to go, they headed for it. Of course, as they walked towards this exit, the guards circled behind them, cutting the route back to the train. The brilliant sun baked the streets that they stepped out onto. Here they were greeted by more guards, but these ones kindly pointed down the road as they blocked the way upward. Mustang led the way as they walked and walked. The streets had all an eerie quiet to them, and unlike in Wasteland City, this rich environment of the rich and famous and popular and rich all looked like it had seen much better days. They looked as they walked with no one talking. On and on they went for what was supposed to be a small little section of town. They were marched into a clearing, a park-like place where the road came to an end and the city barrier walls sheltered the city. Except there was a massive cutaway from the wall, one that allowed the rich people to look out onto the grassy wastelands that stretched below the city itself. It was here that they came to a stop, with the guards pushing them in front of the cutout of the wall. As they all stood there, fleeting glances of a woman walking among the variety of guards, who now tried to take up an appearance of an execution squad. The woman was soon gone, but Mustang still glared at where she'd been. If that was the infamous Augustina mugging, I'd like to talk to you about your little schemes. No one came forward. Instead, the guards tightened their grip on their guns, fixing the sights so that they were just perfect. A sight that was rather odd, since they would be no more than 20 yards away from them. Unless their aim was on the terribly awful side of not being able to hit anything, they shouldn't need their sights. But then Mustang also figured that he'd probably do the same thing, just so that if he did manage to peep the sights, things look all wonky and his aim would be thrown off just from that. A guard crossed in front of the squad that was getting ready to shoot, trying to look regal as he came to a stop and about-faced. "Squad at the ready! Take aim!" Mustang enjoyed what he figured to be the last of a cool breeze of a late morning, and almost missed the sound of metal against stone. It came from behind him, but he didn't dare look over his shoulder, and instead glanced over at his friends Alex and Moneypenny, who both seemed to also have been alerted to the sound, but were trying to do the same thing he was, and that was to find out what was going on without alerting anybody that something had happened. "On the count of 3, not 5, not 2, not 4, not 6. I want you to fire your guns. Do you understand? 3 is the number I want to hear you firing your guns as fast as you can at. Ready? 1, 2... A hiss and a bang went off. "I did not get to the number 3, damn it!" However, more pops and bangs and hisses came from the wall, as well as smoky firecrackers. The noise and confusion reigned over the procession. "I told you to shoot the interlopers, so shoot them." The smoke saved them, as the chaos of noise caused a lot of looking, but not many shots, as everyone tried to figure out what was going on. With nothing keeping them there, Mustang ducked low as shots rang out and headed off towards the side of the park, where he hoped it would be a little quieter. He found that Alex was with him, along with Fraud and Natalie, which was a surprise because he didn't expect them there. A glance around confirmed that Moneypenny was not with them, though, and he turned to head back into the fray to search for her, but Alex grabbed his arm and pulled him back. We'll have our chance later. Now, what are these two doing here, and how did you get here? Fraud offered a smile and then threw out his hand, which neither Alex nor Mustang took up. I thought it looked like it would be some fun to ruin a rich person's day. Is that a good enough reason? All three turned their attention towards Natalie, who was paying a little more attention towards the fight in the park. I'm here to seize the city and free the people of both barriers from corruptions and drugs. I have a reason to believe that the drugs are coming from here. You two were the perfect way to get in. Yeah, and we climbed the wall, by the way. It was a long journey, but we grappled our way up and set off this mess. There's 3 of us, by the way, Natalie. Oh, yes. Moneypenny. I tend to forget she hangs out with the likes of you people. Mustang raised an eyebrow at that, then looked over at Alex, who didn't look pleased at the slightest either. Well, what is your plan here? Fight street to street until we find what we are looking for. What was your plan? We didn't have one, as usual. Mustang doesn't plan. I do. Well, yes, I don't plan, but I don't. Yeah, I didn't plan, but I didn't think about it. We just figured we'd find things as we went. Speaking of which, we need to go find our 2 friends. Goodbye, and have fun with what you're doing. He headed off back into the smoke and mini-explosions of the park, with Alex, for some reason, right behind him. There were also quite a few bullets joining in the mayhem, zinging all over the place. Mustang crept his way across the park, trying to keep low and remain unseen among the smoke and the ongoing gunfight between the townspeople of the original city and the guards. Though who was a bit hard to distinguish, as they all seemed to intermingle in shooting at one another, then falling over. His only saving grace for knowing who might be who was that the townspeople came from the wall and that the guards came from the streets in this rich city. He, along with Alex, did their best to keep out of sight and out of the wrath of either side. They'd managed to make it halfway across the park, but therein lay the tricky part. The center part of the park held a rather long clearing that extended to the road on the other side. There wouldn't be a lick of cover to cover their advance, and Moneypenny, from what Mustang could see, was on the other side. And Alex also helpfully pointed her out. Mustang could only nod as he decided to sprint as fast as he could across the open ground, not bothering to ask if she was going to join him, because the gunfight was rather loud and it was rather hard, and shouting would also attract attention. By the time the duo had gotten to the road where Moneypenny was, she had already moved on. Making matters worse, the day was getting hotter as the early cool of the morning went away, because the sun was rising into its afternoon position. The two found the afternoon heat uncomfortable and sweaty as they turned to head up the road. Making matters worse, the guards seemed to be retreating, but still fighting, as they were now taking to moving backwards, which meant that guns were still shooting at them and bullets were still whizzing about the area. Worse, the smoke was now clearing and there was no more cover. They'd gotten up to the road pretty safely, but were greeted not by Moneypenny, who had ducked away into some house, but rather guards, and ones who had decided that they didn't like the look of Mustang or Alex, and thus had begun to shoot at them. Alex had promptly dropped all pretenses of ducking for cover and slinking along. She'd drawn out her own guns from wherever she had hidden them. Mustang never knew, and he couldn't see any holsters on her, as she began happily returning fire. He wavered a second before getting out his own gun, but kept creeping along, listening to the hiss and spit of bullets flying about. He tried his best to figure out which house that Moneypenny had gone into. but they had all taken on a war-torn feeling and looked similar to his frustration. The further up he went, the further he felt he was getting away from where Moneypenny had gone. But without a firm idea of where she was, the only thing he felt he could do was go forward. He finally stopped when he saw things being thrown from houses to the ground below. There was guards there, and a stopgap barrier being built for said household items. It was quickly being assembled by the guards into a wall to stop the tide of townspeople from Barrier swarming them. The ranks of the citizens from Barrier had swelled into a small army, a sight which was impressive to Mustang as he tried not to get swept up in the matter. With the barrier mostly completed, however, the battle that had surged in favor of the citizens went straight back into a stalemate. The shots from both sides hissing past, Mustang found himself behind a wooden shopping cart that he wondered if it would hold up, and found that Alex was by his side, looking like she was very much in her element as she reloaded her guns again. "Hey, isn't this all a bit off?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, this turned into a gunfight. One was only a search for Matt. Something odd is going on." The fight died down, and since Mustang had been shouting to make sure that he was heard over all the gunfire, this made him stand out. The silence that followed, one might have argued, was on the rather loud side. He peeked over the cart to see Katrina Goddard standing atop the barrier, looking about. Mustang stood up from behind the cart and pointed towards her. "Katrina Goddard, or should I say, Augustina Mugging, where is the man you kidnapped?" She looked down at him from her spot. The look was a cold one that could make people shiver in fear, and also produced a pistol in her hand. "Ah, well, you must die." The gun fired, and then there was an eruption of other gunfire as either side decided now was a good time to fight again. Mustang was flat on his back, staring up at the sky as pain shot across his chest, and then a sudden tugging as he was pulled to the side. He found that he could only stare up vacantly, even as Alex looked him over and pulled away his shirt. "Shit, brilliant. Well done, idiot." "Did I do something?" "Got shot by the person who was going to lead us to X, or Corsair, or whatever his name was." "Is it bad?" "Your skin didn't stop the bullet this time." Another set of hands grabbed a hold of him and decided now was a good time to go to sleep. X desperately wanted to speak up, as that was definitely Mustang's voice he heard, but there was at least 3 guns pointed at him, so he kept quiet. There was a woman beside him who kept looking at him with affection, but who she was, well, it was beyond him, as the woman who'd ordered him into the carriage clambered down from the barrier itself and made her way over to them. She looked at them and then spit off to the side. "Your savior is dead, Corsair. I shot him, and now I need to get rid of you two. But not here. It's too hot here." "I beg your pardon. Who do you think you are? You are engaged to my son, and now you're saying that you're going to kill us? What?" "Shut up, wench. No one likes the rich, and I was never intended to actually marry the idiot Corsair. It's just a shame that my minions failed to do their duty, but we're here now, and I've already got what I wanted." She turned in a huff and marched up the road, and signaled the guard should get the two moving. To this was complied quickly, and soon the whole party was moving with the guards retreating from their newly established wall. The group had continued its retreat across the city, taking whatever roads they could find, but the supply of guards and her gang was rapidly dwindling. Augustina felt like she was caught in a trap, and the only way out might be a fight. However, there wasn't much good cover to spring a counter-trap, as it was the middle of the road, and she wasn't familiar as she'd like to be with this town. It had been hell getting permission to get over here to woo the idiotic Corsair, but worth it, as it got her into money and a new plan. The group stumbled across a large mansion with an equally large patio area hanging out in front. No grass, all stone, and plenty of places that could take a bullet or two. "All right, we will fight here. I'll take the lady and the gentleman into the house to dispose of. You lot get ready to fight." With a flash, she produced a pistol and waved it at X and his mother, Eleanor. The two complied and headed into the house as her guards spread about the patio, the dozen of them running from place to see if they could find the best spot before someone else had occupied it. The sounds of anger were growing, the distance of bullet hisses and shouts from people, likely the townspeople, was growing nearer and nearer. The townspeople were not far off into the distance. Down the road a bit, from the mayhem, Mustang was laid out on a bed, half conscious of the fact that someone was digging around in his shoulder to try and get at something. He figured they were after the bullet, but with a dazed state, it could be anything, really. It could even be an experiment just to see what they could see. This thought sent a shiver through him. "Oh, good, you're still with us. Did that hurt? I'll only be a few more seconds and then you'll be free." The doctor went back to digging around for a few more seconds before popping up and the pressure on Mustang's shoulder subsided. "All good. You should rest up and head over to the train station. They have a train coming in to remove the wounded. Next!" Mustang found himself picked up and floated through the air, his mind taking him a second to realize he was on a stretcher and was being carried away. They carried Mustang a couple of rooms over from where he'd been treated. Then, there, they would gently slide him off the stretcher onto a couple of blankets in the abandoned room. The ones that he'd carried him in went off in the search of some other victim to carry about the place. Feeling the weight of his shoulder, Mustang carefully got up and looked around. The sight was not a pretty one, nor did it smell very nice, as the moans of the wounded invaded his ears. He looked at his left arm, caught in a sling to protect his shoulder. Because of this sling, he realized he was going to struggle to get up and sit up fully. There was no way he was going to stay here, because of all of the noise, the smells, and just the feeling that it was an awful place to be, even if it meant jumping out the window to save himself from all of it. Thankfully, no one showed up as he struggled up to get to his feet and made his way towards the door. Having managed to escape the house, Mustang found himself following a trail of gunshot sounds that echoed about the empty corridors of the city. It was eerie that the place felt nice, but so lonely with no people. That is, aside from the townspeople from the other barrier city, all of whom were rushing about to and from the fight that was somewhere amongst haze of smoke in front of him, along with bullets hissing about the place. He worked his way up, then down the side of the street, with shots getting louder and louder as he went. Augustina found herself wandering around the kitchen table in the house they'd taken shelter in. They'd been forced to take the shelter-in house, although she had decided that this would be the fortress for their last stand. The shelter felt like it was not going to be much of a fortress, as her guards who'd been out on the patio were being pushed back into the house themselves. They were soon feeling quite outnumbered. She bit at her thumbnail and glowered at Corsair. "This is your fault. What did I do? I don't have any memories. Stupid workers I hired managed to fail to kill you, and then your replacement failed to do anything. And why the hell do you have these crap Barrier City people keep attacking? I killed your man. Maybe, little missy, you should have realized that they might not be together. Shut up, wench. Go back to trying to nurse your son on your teeth so that he never grows up." A heavy bang in the nearby room sent some pots and pans clashing from their spots in the cabinets to the ground. It shakes the ground with its heavy feel, and Eleanor tries to take the chance to stand up, but the shaking continued, and she wasn't steady enough on her feet. Augustina, who was steady on her feet, stepped over, grabbed the lapel of Eleanor's dress, and tossed her back to the ground. She turned to look over at Corsair once again, who was trying to steady himself, despite sitting down against the wall. "Well, if they want you, then I shall give them to you." She drew her pistol once again and fired it once at Corsair. Then, grabbing a hold of Eleanor, she pulled her by her hair towards the back door of the kitchen. "You, however, don't get an easy escape. I need someone to hold them off, and you shall do nicely." And with that, they were out of the house. Having gotten to a mansion, Mustang found himself looking at an odd sight where many people had collected and were now running about shouting about something. The major fighting seemed to have stopped, and he looked about trying to figure out what was going on as the townspeople filtered past. He himself headed for the inside of the house upon seeing what he imagined was Alex rushing about inside. He got into the mansion and found himself in a fancy-looking foyer. It was ordained in a nice-looking material, yet everything was bloody. There had been a fight here, and there were a few bodies and injured people left strewn about, along with a few moans coming from deeper inside, along with some hurried voices. Mustang pressed past the blood and bodies, searching for anything to give him an idea of what was going on other than mayhem. He found his way through a maze of corridors and hallways and came upon a kitchen. It wasn't where he thought he was going, but he'd given up on the idea of thinking he was going anywhere, and just gone with the flow of things. As a result, he ran straight into Alex, who stood frozen in the doorway of the kitchen. Ow! She turned surprised, then upon seeing him, tried to push him out of the kitchen, a task which wasn't a successful one despite his injury. Mustang! Ow, ow, what are you doing? I'm saving you from a horrifying sight. What? He pushed his way past to see X lying on the floor with blood pooling about. Though the man's head was hidden by a table, so it could have been anyone, but the lanky frame and everything, it just sort of looked like him. Mustang sprang around the table to see Corsair staring up at the ceiling. Next to him was a bottle of some sort that was spilling out the last of its red liquid. X, are you okay? Was it just the bottle that hit you? Corsair twisted his head to show that a rather nasty gash from a bullet had rushed and cut the side of his neck. There was blood, but it mostly appeared to have clotted. It appears my name is Corsair, and the lady you yelled at and that yelled back at you, she took another woman who's apparently my mom and fled out that door. Alex came over surprised as Mustang helped Corsair get to his feet. She looked around to find a cloth to help wrap up Corsair's open wound. Why were you lying on the ground? It seems she really wanted to shoot me and kill me, so once she shot me, I played dead. Fair thing to do, I suppose. Alright, well, no reason to hang out here. Now that we've found you, let's get out of here and head to the station. What, aren't we going after this woman? You want to go after a criminal who tried to kill me, then X, and will probably stop at nothing to get away? She had found a piece of linen in the cupboard of some sort and moved over to Corsair to wrap the wound. He winced as she does this and looks bleakly at Mustang with pleading eyes. Well, we don't actually have to go after her, but rather make sure she doesn't do anything bad to the woman. That woman was nice to me. Oh, fine. But that would take getting through all of these townspeople, which might or might not happen. But with the amount of people from Barrier around the opening in the park and just around in general, I doubt she'll go out that way. Unless you came in from some other way, Corsair? We got on a train in one city and wound up here, as far as I can tell. And since I'm the only able-bodied person here, I suppose I have to lead the way. Oh yes, if you would be so kind, Alex, it would be appreciated. Plus, you like to shoot things. She shook her head, turned, and headed out the back door with the two wounded men carefully following. With Alex leading the way, the three cut their way through the townspeople, who were doing their best to take over this second city, though they also stopped and asked for directions a few times as well before getting on the right track and the right roads towards the station. The march to the train station came to a sudden and abrupt halt. A variety of townspeople had surrounded the outside of the gray brick building that didn't mesh well with the rest of the glamorous, overdone city. The trio slowed down as they dodged their way around some people who all seemed to be staring at the entrance of this place. Attention! Augustina mugging, there is no way out of the station. Please surrender immediately. There was no response to this request, and everyone continued to stand around waiting for something to happen. That is, except for Alex, who had wandered off to the side of the building with Mustang and Corsair in tow. They found themselves along the side, looking at a drab window that was slightly opened. The only problem was that it was higher up than they could reach, and Mustang figured his shoulder wouldn't allow him to get up there. Well, you first, Mustang. What? We're sending me, the wounded person, in first? It's the only way for us to get in, unless you want to charge the front door. Mustang tried to protest, but Alex and Corsair both seemingly ignored him as they grabbed his legs and then boosted him up. The trio nearly toppled over at first, but with a lot of wiggling and Mustang ditching the sling around his shoulder, and with much pain, he managed to get the window fully open so that he could get somewhat inside. This window offered a small ledge which he could balance himself on enough, and there was enough room for him to manage to turn around slightly and stick his legs into the room inside. He hoped that there was nothing in there that would hurt him if he fell. Then he reached down with a bit of help, grabbed a hold of Alex's arm, and pulled her up as Corsair pushed her. Soon she too was in the window frame, and grabbed at Corsair's arm, and with a little effort fell backwards, and they pulled him in with them. They dropped and tumbled over one another as they found themselves in a dark room, with Mustang decided that he'd rather hang out on the ground, gasping in pain that went through his arm. It struck like a bolt and refused to die down. He could hear the pitter-patter of feet shuffling about them as the room was lit up, as Alex had found a nearby light switch. They found themselves alone in a bathroom. After a few more seconds, they'd managed to organize themselves, and the pain in Mustang's arms decided enough for them to move towards the door. There was also a nice new bright splotch of red on Mustang's shirt. The bathroom door creaked a bit as they opened it and found themselves in a steam-filled room. The train engine was pointed outward and ready to depart. The trio slowly crept closer, trying to figure out what was going on. Miss Augustina, I have warned you time and time again, this is a bad course of action to take. Now, you'll need to disappear. It was your job and your advice in Wasteland City that got me into this mess. I'm not about to make that mistake again. Plus, the people you got to work for me can't even do their jobs right. Kill one man, one, and this whole thing evolves at least a little differently. Unfortunate, but it was not my fault. I hired to what your pay scale was, and since you didn't want to pay more, there was little else I could do. You could have dipped into your own pocket. Yes, that was an option that was quickly discarded, as you hate it when people do things behind your back. And I don't have that much money to spend on things in the first place. A bit of steam subsided to reveal Augustina and Focke-Wulf standing there besides Eleanor, who was kneeling on the ground beside them, her face bloodied and bruised. Mustang reached for his own gun as the smoke cleared. They were all now, however, in the clear, and Eleanor had spotted something that was of interest to her. My darling baby boy is okay. Augustina and Focke-Wulf both spun as Mustang got his pistol. The train whistled its mournful cry and released more steam. A few flashes of gunfire shattered the air. Then it all fell quiet for a second. Mustang knew he wasn't hit, but with this new steam he couldn't tell where anyone was. The lone sound that came to him was the squeal of metal on metal. Stop the train! Stop the train! He said this despite knowing that it probably wasn't possible to stop it. Having chugging chug of the train getting itself moving at a quicker pace, followed by another belt blast from its horn, announced that it was indeed leaving. Then came a loud noise from the door, as Mustang figured that the townspeople were now coming in to see what had happened, having heard the gunshots from inside. But the smoke hadn't cleared, and it took a few more seconds for everything to settle down. When it did, though, there was no Focke-Wulf or Augustina. There was just Eleanor Bonaparte, shot and lying on the ground, dying. Corsair rushed over towards her and was soon beside her. Mustang looked to Alex, then to the townspeople and Natalie, who'd shown up. Seeing both of them staring at the scene, he couldn't bear to look at the sight of Corsair and his mother, Eleanor, so he stepped outside. Once outside, in the fresh air, he found himself surprised, as Moneypenny was leaning against the wall next to the train station. She was looking over the wounded who had been arranged for extradition. The sight reminded himself of his own wound, and he winced as he reached for it. His effort to soothe the pain away by rubbing it drew her attention. "You okay?" "I got shot and it pierced the skin. Thank you for your concern, though, and before you can ask if I've had it attended to, yes, I have. There is, however, someone else who could use some help inside." "Who?" "X, or Corsair, or whatever he goes by. His mother needs help. She's didn't look good from what I saw." She instantly straightened up and got off of the wall, looking like there was business to be done, and since there was, she charged past him to get inside. He watched her, then turned and walked down the street to find some place that was quiet, so that it would allow him to rest for a bit. He found himself back at the park, staring out over the grassy wasteland below. The sky was starting to turn from its bright blue to a darker hue that was letting a twinkle of stars through, all of which was casting a distant calmness that didn't quite work well with his shot nerves. Worse, there were several townspeople busily working away, climbing up and down the ropes to attend to matters. He sat down on the grass and looked at the stars, trying to let the noisy quiet falling over him as he laid down to enjoy it all. That and the fact that the heavy feeling of a need for sleep called to him. It was almost so heavy that he failed to notice that the people were picking him up and placing him on a stretcher. He wanted to get up and protest, but the wave of tiredness was too much, and he soon found himself being lowered down the wall. When he arrived at the end of a long journey to the bottom of the wall, Mustang found that the stretcher he'd been placed on was being carried off towards a cart, where he was unceremoniously dumped in with a few other wounded people. A few minutes after that, the cart was filled with more and more injured people, and then rattled to life as it set off on its trek. The cart had been wheeling its way down a long and dusty pathway that was cut from the rich separate barrier city towards the regular city, or at least that's what Mustang figured was going on, since he couldn't really tell, as the cart was covered and offered little in the way of directions. He rose as best he could from the stretcher he was on. The group of men and women, who were mostly asleep aside from one man, who was glaring at him. Is there a problem?" "Are you Hugh Mustang?" "Yes, what of it?" "You cost me a great deal." Mustang did his best to stand up on the rocking cart to confront the man, but the man also got up and grabbed him. The hold did not last for long, as Mustang found himself being pushed over the edge of the cart and out. The drop, which was more than a few feet off the ground, was not a pleasant one. Mustang found himself tumbling head over heels until he managed to come to a stop on the road. More than a few carts rattled past near his head, and it was only his own movement that saved him from being squished under heavy wheels. Wheezing and tired, Mustang watched a few of the big carts rumble by as he rearranged himself so that he could sit up and try and draw some attention to his plight. But there was too much dust even in this grassy wasteland. When the last one had rumbled by on its merry way, he found it was far too late, and even waving his hands was not going to get anybody's attention. Worse, the dust didn't settle for a little while, and by the time it did, it revealed that the carts were long gone, and that only the tire tread tracks were visible and would lead him to safety. The trail that Mustang found himself on had gone cold, as the night had gone to morning and was now in the afternoon. The warm, sweltering heat of this was starting to get to him as he was plodding along, hoping another convoy of carts might come hurrying along, but this had not happened and did not look likely to. He wondered if he was wandered off the route that was supposed to be following, as the ruts and the dust were long gone. All he could see was a nearby tree that was surviving among all of the tall grass. Exhausted from all of the walking he had done, he headed as best he could, with his whole body aching in pain. The shade from the tree offered a minor escape, as the humid air hung about and didn't let anyone forget about it. He slumped his way over towards the tree and sat down. The heat and the exhaustion of the long night soon claimed him as he fell asleep. Focke-Wulf and Fraud stood in front of Fraud's office on the second floor of the Barrier City train station. They stared down at the now empty hall, aside from a few gathering people. Our friend Mustang disappeared. Yes, his friends are staying in the city for now, thanks to the new mayor. But they're looking for him. Reports are that he was on one of the carts and then vanished. Lost out in the Wasteland, a terrible way to go. He's probably still alive. He was born out there in that wasteland, so he'll know a few things. Well, yes, probably, but I feel guilty. I think I should go find him. Focke-Wulf stretched for a second and then began heading down the walkway. Fraud, however, continued to stare at the empty hall below them. The late evening hour let the moon peek in from the skylight windows above. Before you do that, Focke-Wulf, if you could answer a question, why did you help out the criminal Augustina? I suspect it's for the same reason you did, Fraud. Money. The man walked down the walkway, with Fraud watching him and shaking his head. Once the big-shot private detective Focke-Wulf disappeared from sight, Fraud took a careful glance about and then went into his office. It had taken Focke-Wulf much of his evening scaring up a set of horses for his journey across the infected wasteland. A few horses could survive the trip out there and back without special equipment, and in a city ravaged by drugs and taken down many notches by the war fought against any drugs, it had left supplies mounting to little, as people sold their stuff to the cheapest bidder and ran for safety of not getting involved in such terrible matters. And those supplies had soon found themselves whisked away from the city entirely. Still, he'd managed the task and had snuck his way around to the only gate to the wasteland from the city. A run-down, hobbled-together place that had been forgotten by time but used by the rich to quietly go about their lives. His horses neighed and complained as he approached, but passed through with little trouble as he set out. The slow path of a road took Focke-Wulf through the winding section of wasteland grass. The road was designed this way to keep people from the worst of the exposure zones, which radiated a deadly toxin. The man carefully led his two mounts through the rough area, looking for any signs that Mustang had been around. The high grass certainly could hide a man in it, but he doubted that a man would just wander off the road, knowing how much they knew about the wastelands. Mustang felt the harsh sun touching him. He thought he had been in a safe spot in the shade of the tree. He forced his tired eyes open, the shade having gone from the early afternoon sun. He looked about, trying to figure out if he'd been asleep for long or if it'd been a quick little nap, though as he blinked the feeling of crustiness in his eyes told him it had been at least been some time. Mustang wiped his eyes and tried to get up, but his arm was still out of it and he fell back against the tree. It was then that he noticed a figure with two horses approaching him, cutting their way across the long grass straight to him. He watched defenseless, with no guns to his name, as Focke-Wulf came to a stop right in front of him. Afternoon. Hello? Hello, Focke-Wulf. Or should I say hello to my enemy? Well, shall we do this the easy way or the hard way, Mustang? End of part 6. Thank you for listening.